Sandstorm.
You guys are probably aware to some degree of the singularity, the idea of the singularity. Is probably popularized most by Ray Kurzweil, who observed a set of patterns. And that set of patterns was the rate at which processing power increased over time. It seemed to be a startling regularity moving forward in time. And from that, Kurzweil extrapolated that we would hit a point that was suggested before by John von Neumann, one of the original computer systems architects, and also later by the science fiction writer Werner Winge. And this point, the singularity, the idea is once computer processing power in parallel with machine learning and advanced AI reaches a certain point, you'll get to a situation called the singularity, a theoretical point beyond which we'll get emergent superintelligence. And emergent superintelligence is scaring the shit out of people, right? Because after all, if the machines can do things better than everybody, if the machines become sentient and self-replicating in their intelligence and part of a networked evolutionary system that iterates upon itself much, much faster than what humans can, that we might reach a point where we could be, in the worst case scenarios, living at the behest of the machines as their servants or something like that in the worst case scenarios, and in the best case scenarios, they are advanced enough to have some sort of moral sense and take pity on us, and then maybe hopefully later we are able to network with them or join them or upload or upgrade our own intelligences to the point where there's a sort of fusion. That's a good scenario in the minds of people who believe that the singularity is near. I join the people who believe the singularity is near. I think this is happening. I think the rate of Moore's law is going to Moore's law-like phenomena, that they are having an effect. There are some aspects of AI right now that mainly you can imagine, just a tiny part of the prefrontal cortex that is our logic and reasoning center, that basically computer coders and machine learning applications are isolating this part of the human brain and really just kicking ass on it. So it's a very tiny sliver of the whole mind-brain cluster. So we got a long way to go towards the singularity, but we're approaching it. But I'm not here to talk today about the singularity except to set the stage, to let you know what the singularity is, because over here, quietly for most, there's a revolution happening. And that revolution, call it what you will, I call it the social singularity. And I want to spend the next 30 to 45 minutes persuading you that the social singularity is also near, and that it is just as important as fear of robot armies and unemployed laborers, okay? That this process of the social singularity, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, is happening, it's real, and it is virtually inevitable, okay? So consider that in our human dealings, okay? Marshall McLuhan, this Canadian philosopher, had said once, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know the exact quote, but we shape our tools, and our tools in turn shape us. Analogously, we can riff on that a little bit and say, we shape our rules, and our rules shape us. And what happens with this coevolutionary process of developing our own new rules, our own new tools, and blockchain, these latest innovations that we decentralists really love and appreciate, we're at the forefront of this revolution, and we're going to start to see the ways in which these technologies shape us, we shape them in this kind of vacillating tandem. Back and forth. Our cultural values are changing. They will change as more and more people begin to adopt these technologies, and this is just the beginning. Our technological capabilities and our new rule sets are allowing us to interact in ways that we've never been able to before in human history, and this is unprecedented. So when we extrapolate this fact out in time, what do we get? That's really the question here. But let me talk first about what it means to, what do I mean by coevolutionary forces of culture and tools, or culture and rules? Think of it like this. A decade ago, it would have been virtually unheard of. You would have been called crazy if you got into a car with a stranger. Okay? So that's a real simple example. A decade ago, if you'd gotten into a car with a stranger hitchhiking, people would have warned you against that. It's dangerous, you shouldn't do it, that sort of thing. Same with staying in some random person's home. But today, this is commonplace. This is very new because of the advent of technology that has changed, has detabooized the idea of getting into a car with a stranger, because we've been able to inject reputation systems that let us trust people more. Okay? So this phenomenon of cultural change going alongside technological and institutional change, and when I say institutions, what I really mean are the rules of the game. Okay? So when I appeal to the idea of institutions, I'm talking about the rules of the game. These technologies are decentralizing us. And that decentralization process is going to cross more and more domains of activity. Okay? But just what kinds of domains of activity am I talking about? It seems like, okay, everybody loves Bitcoin. They talk about Bitcoin. Bitcoin 101 is suddenly, throughout human history, we've had stuff like paper money or seashells or all this stuff as some way of describing that we have value in something. A store of value and then a medium of exchange. And most of the time, as we develop robust economies, we've had these intermediaries, these what we call mediating structures. And in the case of money, that has been large financial institutions, and later on, the government backing it. Okay, so we have this some would say unholy alliance between business and government that gives us the monetary system we have today. And that monetary system, by virtue of its nature as an evolved entity, it tends to benefit the few, and that accretes near the top of a kind of social hierarchy. So when we're thinking about mediating structures of society, we're thinking about social hierarchies. Now, what do I mean when I say hierarchy? Back in the old times, the Paleolithic era, say, when we were hunter-gatherers, we roamed around in tribes. Okay? We hunted, we gathered, and we depended on each other in these small units, usually less than 150, which is Dunbar's number. We roamed the Paleolithic steppe, doing our thing. We relied on each other in small bands. But beyond that, we didn't really organize ourselves beyond that, because it would have been too complex state of affairs. Something happened with the agricultural revolution, however, and the agricultural revolution caused us to settle down as a human species. And that settling down around crops mingled with wandering tribes and settlements meant we were required by the new complexity of living in this settled world, that there would be conflicts, that there would be territorial disputes. That caused us as a human species to organize in a different way. Sometimes you're more effective as a group if you have a singular decision maker at the top, bidirectional flows down chains of command in this hierarchical structure. Basically, you have a clan king saying, we're going to attack them and raid their stuff, or we're going to trade with them, they're okay. But essentially, a single decision maker at the top who everyone sort of reports to in a chain of command. This is called a command and control system, or a hierarchy. This predominated throughout much of the world. Of course, you had exchange relationships that were going on, around it, so that simultaneously there's hierarchy, and simultaneously there are these commercial networks forming, or people, gains from trade and all that good economic stuff that happens. But we really are suddenly no longer in the tribal era, we're in the era of hierarchies. As we began to globalize, as we began to trade with each other more, as we began to communicate with each other more, we got into a situation where suddenly we no longer see the need for these hierarchical structures. So there's this tension, these two forces that are at odds in some ways. And a lot of people would argue that the hierarchies that we're familiar with, for example, the government protecting our rights, the difference between mine and thine, so on, that these mediating structures were necessary for the commercial relationships to exist. And I think to some extent they were right from a historical perspective. So we have to trust these guys to enforce property rights. We have to trust these guys to enforce the law, to make the law, and to reflect upon the law. That mediating structure in society becomes the dominant force of most of civilization. But something happened in around 2007, 2008, maybe a little bit earlier. Some person, and indeed some folks, were sitting around thinking about how to develop a technology that would obviate a certain mediating structure, namely the banks. Okay, and in 2008, as everyone knows, everything was going tits up. Everything was going tits up. And people were looking for a way to get rid of this unholy alliance between the financial institutions and government, because that essentially socialized the costs and privatized the benefits. And it was a wreck for many years, and we've only now just begun to recover from it. But that was a catalyzing moment for some person named Satoshi Nakamoto, who surely read the works of Nick Szabo, for example, surely hung around with a guy named Hal Finney. And they set about asking themselves, when you have emergent law, when you have emergent money, when I say emergent, I mean patterns of interactions among individuals that are unguided and yet rule sets emerge, we have a situation where we know law can emerge, and it's called the common law. So what if we take the most elegant and useful patterns of emergent law, namely common law, and instantiate that in technology that cannot be changed by intermediaries, that cannot be affected because you have to be a code breaker in order to do it, and a really, really fucking good code breaker at that. So there we get the blockchain revolution. We're suddenly instantiating the beautiful, elegant aspects of the common law, which is the law of human interaction, essentially. Same with money. We're able to suddenly exchange with each other without intermediaries, without the need to depend on the intermediary that can become predatorial. Whoa. That's just one aspect of us headed inexorably towards the social singularity. So this transition can be described in another way. I don't want to get too wonky about complex systems. But if you think about it just in information terms, when you have a hierarchy, the nodes in the network have to take information in the form and translate that into form of commands that need to be executed. The structure of the hierarchy makes it such that there is a theoretical point beyond which there's too much information and you're going to get breakdown, or you're going to have a complexity transition to change. What does that transition look like? It goes from a hierarchy to a network. We begin to lateralize our relationships, just like we do here at Burning Man, interestingly. Okay? This is very lateralized set of relationships. All of us here, we sometimes, we have this sort of asymmetrical leadership sometimes, and we trade off being leaders when we need to, and that's okay. But essentially, this is a very bottom-up, self-organizing event, and it's fucking beautiful in that respect. Okay? So this vision of a decentralized society, though it's not a perfect analog with Burning Man, shares a lot of similar characteristics. So we said, looking at the singularity, that we think it's near because of this seemingly law-like advance of Moore's Law type phenomena. Connectivity among peers is proceeding in exactly the same way, and there's a sense of inevitability to it. Now, the old mediating structures are strong, and they have their own immune system. They're going to fight against this change because there's a lot of people who benefit from the old order. Slowly but surely, however, we shape our tools and our tools shape us. We shape our rules and our rules shape us. And that happens as a spreading activation. It happens like Daniel Dennett described the evolutionary process as being like the universal acid. Anything, any domain it touches, it's going to happen. You cannot stop it. Evolution happens. Likewise, the social singularity, the subversive innovation that is happening right now that connects people and binds human beings together and laterally, where the energy flows are very much like the dome around us, the structure of the dome around us, as opposed to a pyramidal structure. In fact, it's more like a fractal. So we're going to move from a pyramid order to a fractal order, I truly believe. Now, you may not buy this idea that is inevitable, but let me also explain that part of the hierarchical state of affairs that we currently see right now is a kind of zero-sum or even negative-sum state of affairs. Just consider the last election. Half the United States, for our people from other countries here, bear with us. Yanks are always so inward-looking, but you probably heard about the Trump election. Half the country is completely fucking apoplectic, and they should be. But we live in this condition currently called electoral politics. And this is a broken, backwards, hoary way of making social change. We have venerated the democratic process for years because we traded ballots for bullets. And that is wonderful. It is a way to transition peacefully, although it seems to be showing its cracks recently as people are warring in the streets. I believe that politics is starting to make us worse people. So our tools are starting to shape us in negative ways. Our old rules are starting to shape us in negative ways. And I believe this transition will shape us in more positive ways as well. Politics sucks. Some of you may think I'm crazy for saying this, but I believe our electoral politics is a grand illusion. When you go and vote, you're crying a teardrop in the ocean, and that ocean will wash over you just as soon as you can blink an eye. It is somewhat unpredictable, and it is usually a tit-for-tat or kind of king of the mountain or tug-of-war environment where you're putting two, in the United States anyway, because we don't have a parliamentary system, two camps at odds with each other. And the only outcome is for one camp to be pulled into the mud. That is not a system that can be sustained for a long time, particularly as when the winning camp gets to rule, they don't really make the rules anyway. Because sitting on the sidelines of politics, as we know, is money, special interest. And that's what's really in charge all over the world. These unholy alliances that I spoke of earlier between business and the state, forming what we might call state capitalism, or what we might call the problems of public choice theory. If you've never heard of public choice theory, the idea is that people are more or less, when they're in politics, have to be selfish in order to survive politically, and they'll often sell off their cultural values, whatever those might be. Not always, but for the most part, in a game of horse trading with special interest, because you will not long last in politics if you don't play that game. But that game is totally destructive to the social order. We know that. We saw it in 2008 that it's destructive. when we know that in local municipalities, when taxpayers who can barely afford a cup of coffee have to pay for a billionaire's sports stadium, all in the name of the public good. We have this struggle for who gets to belly up to the trough of financial resources and who gets to pull the levers of power. This is not what a decentralized order looks like. Okay? A decentralized order looks very, very different. It is much more anarchic. I said the A word. Oh my gosh, anarchy. You know, anarchy in this case does not mean going out with Molotov cocktails in the streets and throwing them at people you hate. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It really just means we're headed asymptotically for an order that has rules, and we're governed by rules, and we choose the rules by which we're governed, but not rulers. So it's rules over rulers. And that sounds crazy. No, we need the wise elites. We need the philosopher kings to make sure that everything's okay. We need to ensure that they get in office so that they'll protect us. This paternalistic top-down hierarchical structure is no longer necessary. And we know that here. We can choose our leaders. The people who serve us in their leadership, we will go to them. We will flow to them, just like we do at Burning Man. There are a lot of leaders here like that. Hell, I'm looking at people here that have bossed me around all week, and bless them for it, because I'm kind of living my head all the time. So I digress. But this process of going to rules over rulers doesn't mean we're always going to be without hierarchy. But hierarchy is going to be what we call nested, at least in the interim, I believe, as we approach the social singularity, in what we call polycentricity. Okay? Polycentricity is a big kind of fancy word, but it just means that the locus of power in a system is decentralized. It might not always be that hierarchies go away. Sometimes hierarchies can work. But when you have a polycentric order, when you have lots of centers of power, even federalism or decentralization the old-fashioned way, like the good old founding fathers way, you get the ability, you reduce the cost of exit. Okay? When you reduce the cost of exit, it doesn't matter if there are power hierarchies in existence. They either serve you or they don't. And if they don't serve you, you leave. That's the beauty of it. That's why I named my event in Austin, Texas. Oh, I'm not supposed to be commodifying. Sorry about that. Apologies. But I have an event in Austin called Voice and Exit, and I want to talk about that because I'm so passionate about that idea that we can exercise our voice, our expression, to try to persuade. Persuasion is there are only two peaceful means of social change. That is exercising expression, voice, and exit, which is leaving a system to start a new system that is better and to attract new people into it. This is the human algorithm. This is the algorithm of peace. I believe that in my bones. That's not to say there won't be violence. That's not to say that the world's going to be rosy and perfect. Human beings, we have our inborn dispositions to hierarchy. We have our inborn dispositions to violence. But our tools and our rules shape us. And when we see the benefits, recarving the incentives of our new systems, recarving us as human beings, we will start to adopt new cultural values. Let me talk just a moment about those cultural values, and then I want to talk to you guys because this is getting too hierarchical. There is a ton of different theories of culture and cultural change. One of them you may be familiar with is spiral dynamics. And spiral dynamics envisions psychosocial development of the human being and of human groups as an upward spiral, starting with the very basics, moving up into tribal animist, then into warlike and conquest, the egoistic phase, which is this is all designated by colors, so that's red. And you move up into blue, reining in the excesses of domination and egoism, or egotism. And then We move up into the blue stratum, which is the values of hierarchy, which can, you have deference to a higher power, and everyone knows his or her place in the order of things. This is a very useful. It might sound like a kind of conservatism that you don't like, but this is a very, very useful way to mute the excesses of the prior stage. We move up from blue because people were tired of the old church hierarchies of the Middle Ages and began to think for themselves. The optical lens, for example, was a tool that shaped us because suddenly we were able to observe the universe and challenge the orthodoxies around us, a la Galileo. Suddenly, our culture changes, our values change. We have a commercial society where people going out and trading value for each other. We get the Renaissance, which is one of the most prosperous times in human history up to at that point. The rebirth, as it were, of civilization. We have then the scientific revolution, where people began to observe the natural world around us and try to understand it through observation rather than faith or dogma. So that's the orange band, and it's powerful, and it's still very much with us. And then, of course, that has its own excesses. We're moving way over into our left brain, and we forget our heart. We forget about consensus. We figure out that everything is not an algorithm. It's not scientific. It's not commercial. And then you get the green band, and that's basically the hippies. That's a lot of the heart-centered people who are here. They're muting the excesses of the scientific commercial culture. And hippie culture or egalitarian culture is a culture of sharing. It's a culture of love. It's a culture of veneration for the environment, which we need. But it too has its excesses. It too has its excesses. It turns into people being violent in the streets and not being loving. It turns into the hatred of all of the strata below it. And this, we get in the first tier of the spiral, in spiral dynamics, we get warring colors, essentially. They're not the same colors as red and blue, which is our American colors for who's fighting each other. But you get orange, blue, and green fighting amongst themselves in electoral politics in this big shit show I was describing earlier. So what do we do culturally if we begin to come together to connect with one another as human beings through technological means? We begin to connect with one another through human means as well. We start to adopt the values of connectivity, to adopt the values of networks. Well, what does that look like? Well, the first thing we do is we can also change cognitively. We're going to start to change. We're going to start to think in system terms. Okay? We're not going to think about everything constantly being designed. Like this has to be designed from the top down. We think about emergent systems more when we transcend to the second tier of the spiral. This is a quantum leap, by the way. The second tier of the spiral is quantum leap in cultural values. And do I need to change mics? This quantum leap means we become systems thinkers. We are able, and this is the most important cultural aspect, to look at the lower stratum from which we came as we ascended, the lower strata. We look at those and we say, there's something important and beautiful about blue. There's something important and beautiful about orange, and so on. So, that is a monumental change, a quantum leap for human beings to start to get into the second tier. If you even believe in this, there's all kinds of different theories of psychosocial development, sociology, I could go on about. But this is a useful one because I think it really tracks with the idea of our connecting with each other more readily as a human species. Being able to surpass Dunbar's number and have experiences like this. This is integrating and transcending all of the values of the spiral. They're all important. They all have context in which they're important. If we're going to all go play in a football game, we want to have red values. Fucking kill them, right? Get them. That's okay sometimes in certain contexts. Sometimes when we go see our grandparents and they're churchy and they're conservative, we want to appreciate how that took them to where they are in their existence. When we hanging out at Burning Man, and there's the Naked Heart folks, and they're just all full of green. We have a lot to learn from them, especially Bitcoiners, because Bitcoiners tend to be really ultra left brain. And the structures that Bitcoin and the blockchain and other decentralization technologies are going to enable is going to need more than the highly algorithmic or rationalistic thinking of the left brain. It's going to need more of that heart focus. It's going to need more right brain, creativity, connection with the human, the totality, the whole of our human selves. So thinking holistically along these lines allows us to ascend as human beings in parallel with the technology. That's a beautiful, beautiful idea, especially when we get to a place like turquoise on the spiral, which is really when we are able cognitively and spiritually to think really in terms of these nested subsystems, the holons, the relationships between parts and wholes, understanding the value of the entire system and its relationship to each of the pieces. That is a cognitive and spiritual leap for a lot of people. Perhaps not this crew, but for a lot of people it is. Thinking in terms of holons is crackers to the average voter. But as our rules shape us and our tools shape us, the concomitant change in our spiritual and cultural values will ascend the spiral with the changes. So that's my hope. And there's a point beyond which when those cultural values and our technology changes and pulls with such gravity the human species into it, there will be fits and starts. Let me tell you, there's going to be epic battles between hierarchies and networks, hierarchies and decentral systems. There's no doubt about it. It will be as a war in a lot of respects. But ultimately, there is a sense of inevitability to the social singularity. That's why we want to call it that. There's a point beyond which we have bound to each other as molecules, and it'll be exceedingly difficult to pull them back apart, particularly with inferior, lesser strata of social change. So, does that make sense? Yeah,
they won't hear it in the video.
sure. So she asked, what can we do here and now? Are things, in my opinion, and I want to hear others, by the way, answers to this, that we can do to catalyze this process. I keep going on and on about culture and not just technology, because most of the folks in the Decentral camp are. I sort of represent the cultural and philosophical side, as you can see. I'm not a techie, and thank you guys for being badasses at tech, because I can't help you there. But what I think one of the things we can do is more right brain folks, more heart-centered folks can figure out how to work as a braid with the technologies we're seeing. And I'm trying to do that with a nonprofit I've just started, for example, called Social Evolution. And I think it's okay to shill for a nonprofit. I hope so anyway. The other thing I think we can do is we can begin, and this is where I think the techies really come in, make it super, super easy to use decentralized applications. Make it super simple for people, super intuitive. Work with people who have a marketing sensibility and a spiritual sensibility to design interfaces that are inviting and intuitive. So you're like, so it's like breathing. How did I live without this for so long? And they tell other people, and the process becomes viral and self-replicating. How can we design these interfaces, not just with the back-end tech being so sophisticated and incredible with the crypto and everything, but on the front end, getting people so I can take this to my mom or my grandmother or say, this is what we're looking at. Check this out. Do you ever want to go back? That, I think, would be another thing that we can do. And I think some of this is going to be part not of our own direction, which is what you asked, what we can do. But I think it's also not just what we can do, but what emerges from what we do. we're going to see all of the evolution, as we said. This is an evolutionary fitness landscape that we're dealing with crypto tech. So it's going to iterate, and we're going to see successes and failures. And part of that successes might not just be network effects. Like Bitcoin was the first, so look at its market cap. It might also be, holy shit, this is really awesome. This is a game changer in terms of the way it pulls people into its orbit with usefulness. But that usefulness will be determined not by any single individual. Well, certainly the lucky team of designers get lucky. But luck from the standpoint of an evolutionary system, nobody can plan it. It's emergent. So we're going to see the emergent shakeout. We're going to see some 80-20 kind of phenomena happening in the near future as well. And when you take all these things together, I think we're going to start to get rapid adoption. Still very early. Anybody else have ideas about what we can do now? Because I'm super curious about that.
Thanks, Max. Leverage cryptocurrency. I know we are talking about centralization and decentralization in broad terms, but cryptocurrency, we've had some chat. What do you think?
Well, yeah, no, that's a really good question. One of the things I think I want to credit Colin with this concept. I don't know if it's yours originally, but it's a good one. Is maybe that we jokingly called it universal basic knowledge, which is a temporary universal basic income where you essentially give people, a lot of people, a little bit of cryptocurrencies so they can have it and use it and see what it's like. And that creates the network effects. In the beginning, it sort of catalyzes it at the beginning. That may not be possible, but I think it very well could be. It's like, hey, I'm going to give you a gift. You know, the first thing you do in Burning Man culture, I'm finding, and boy, I've been a recipient of this from the moment I arrived, is gift culture. That binds people as human beings, creates a cultural and a technological connection. So that might be one way. The bad way that this all could be catalyzed is for the hierarchical structures and unholy alliances between the financial system and the government to continue at pace, and we have another financial crisis. Not a whole hell of a lot has been changed about our financial system since 2008, and it could be that we have another of these events where it's just a cascade of failure. When that happens, these anti-fragile systems are going to be adopted out of necessity, not out of, oh, this is cool, let me try it out, or my friend told me this was awesome, or I can make some money. It's going to be I have to have somewhere to turn, and when you can turn to an anti-fragile system like a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, these might be given a lot of life out of the failure of the old system. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we can win with the good stuff first. But if necessity and collapse drives us into this world, it is the social safety net waiting for us. We are the social safety net. Anybody else want to talk about this stuff? Yes, sir.
One of the... Okay. If you go back in the history of capitalism, which we don't have right now, but there was that concept of the tragedy of the commons.
Beautiful.
Where it's appropriated, certain forces appropriate what everybody owns or what everybody uses, let's put it that way.
Yes.
And they become the owners. And
yes.
How do you, can you see that there's any there's any way that could be incorporated in the structure, the decentralized structure that you're talking about to fight against that kind of a process?
This is an excellent question. So let me back up for a moment and just give viewers and folks a little bit of background on the idea of the tragedy of the commons. When you have let's say it's a piece of territory, or let's say it's an object. I have a cup. Okay. the idea is it could be shared. We could share it, but I could use it for a little while, and you could use it for a little while. But when I have it, it's mine. When you have it, it's thine. That mine and thine difference is a very, very important institutional difference when we're dealing with physical objects, whether it's land or a cup. And the reason that we have tragedy of the commons is we don't have the assignment of property rights. When you have the assignment of property rights, which sounds greedy, it sounds selfish, but when you don't have the assignment of property rights, you get two problems. You don't have the precondition of trade, and you have a race to exploit the resource, a race for people to use it up before someone else gets it. If we have a difference between mine and thine in institutional terms, that means we have an incentive to be stewards of resources. I know that sounds like, no, but capitalism's supposed to be wasteful. In a lot of senses, it's not. It's much more wasteful to have a commons. Commons can be managed, shared resources can be managed, but they need to be managed hyper-locally. The complexity problems that we identified earlier mean that you can't. Eleanor Ostrom, who's a brilliant political scientist, actually won the first female Nobel Prize winner in economics, came up with this whole idea of managing the commons in a highly localized way through polycentricity. So you might have hierarchies governing the commons locally, but that's all that's going to be possible. Now, the great thing about Bitcoin, for example, is it's not a physical object. We're treating it as if it were scarce, but the underlying technology of Bitcoin is such that, and the network technologies, we want to establish in an artificial way, meaning man-made way, the difference between mine and thine, so that the commercial networks become possible. So you get this back and forth action that you would with physical objects. But the interesting thing about technology in general, whenever you make a line of code, and this is what's great about open source, is it is actually, when it comes down to brass tacks, not physical. So that means it's infinitely reproducible. You can get a tragedy of the commons phenomenon in Coinland when we say, okay, well, we're just gonna give everybody a bunch of money and infinitely reproduce it. Well, it becomes valueless. This is what the money printers do, as you know, in the Fed. But from the standpoint of just basic technology and why it's important that how we can have forks and competing cryptocurrencies and different systems from which to exit and enter, reducing the cost of exit and expanding the choices to people, is because we don't have the singular nature of a physical object. Does that make sense? So this idea, the tragedy of the commons, and for Bitcoin, a festival of the commons, is really an important concept. I'm really glad you brought that up. And I got that term, by the way, from Andronopoulos, one of the first in the Bitcoin Foundation. Anybody else? Thoughts on this stuff? Cultural values? Thank you guys so much for coming and listening to me gab for 45 minutes or however long it was. I really appreciate you.
I had a query.
Okay.
What do you think would be the best practical steps we could take to bring about all the good things?
That was similar to what she asked earlier, but in the macro sense, you mean? I think
sure.
I think one of the things that you're doing, I think one of the things we're doing right now is really, really excellent. I know this sounds kind of trite, but we're kind of being evangelists we have a camp called Decentral. And being a part of that camp is super meaningful to me. Like, I feel like the luckiest guy in the world to be a part of it. That is the stuff that cultural memetics are made of. And I'm going to go away and evangelize decentralized technologies, no doubt about it. I've been washed in the blood. Thank you, guys.
I have one thing too. I hurt my back, so I couldn't get up.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring up, because you were asking for input on this. During my talk yesterday, we had a great audience member. I don't think I got her name. She was talking about inclusivity And one thing that arises for me, you mentioned how you're not a technologist. I'm not particularly a technologist either. I'm more of a theorist. Documentation that makes sense. Documentation that makes sense to everyone, and different explaining all of these concepts in. Oh dear, hi there. Explaining all of these concepts in many different types of language, I think, is one of the most crucial steps we can take moving forward. And I think that's something like your speech and a couple of the other speeches that are less, hopefully mine as well, like less technically focused, more human-centric, can help to spread this to the communities within Burning Man. And that sort of inclusivity gets us more creative ideas within our revolution. So thank you for your speech.
Thank you. That's beautifully put. Say? Yeah.
Yeah, a good way to help spread the movement, I find, is accepting for goods and services. If you're going to crash on a friend's house, throw him a little Bitcoin rather than some cash if he's willing to accept it. Like that makes it that much more real when it's more than just trading numbers on a screen.
Yeah, this is the last mile ecosystem stuff. We got to get there for sure. Yeah, it's got to be more than HODL. It's got to be use.
Sandstorm.